Battlestar Galactica premiered in 2003, and more than 20 years later, it still looks more believable than most sci-fi being made right now, despite budgets, effects technology, and production values all being objectively better today. That's not an accident. It's the result of one deliberate choice made before a single frame was shot. Creator Ronald D. Moore rejected the entire tradition of space opera, like stock characters, technobabble, sleek impossible technology, in favor of what he called naturalistic science fiction. The goal was for the show to feel like a documentary crew had wandered onto a real ship in the middle of a real war, and nobody had warned them there'd be robots in it. That single decision cascades into every visual choice this show made. Things like architecture, gadgets, or clothes, none of it was built to look like the future. It was built to look like something that could actually break. So today, we're breaking down exactly how they pulled that off. 5 design choices that still make a 2003 show feel more real than most of what's airing right now. Let's start with the one thing every other choice in this show was built on top of. Before Battlestar Galactica had a single sci-fi element on screen, it had a submarine. That's literally how the production was pitched. Ronald Moore and executive producer David Icke described the interior of Galactica to the production designer as Das Boot in space. Not Star Trek, not Star Wars. A cramped, pressurized World War II-era submarine, but in a spaceship, and you can see it immediately in the ship's command center. CIC, which is real naval terminology, not invented sci-fi jargon. It does the job of both a bridge and a tactical operations room. Same logic applies to the pilots. Viper launches, deck crew hand signals, flight discipline, call signs. All of it is built from how a real carrier air wing actually operates, not from what looks cool in a dogfight. Pilots get chewed out for being late. Deck crews are exhausted. Nobody salutes dramatically before a mission. They just get the job done. And here's a detail that didn't age the way anyone expected. In 2020, the U.S. Space Force revealed its actual dress uniform. Deep navy blue, diagonal row of buttons down the front. People immediately noticed it looks almost identical to the colonial officer uniforms on this show. Fiction borrowed the logic of real military design so convincingly that years later, a real military ended up looking like it borrowed the fiction back. Compare that to a lot of modern sci-fi, where a military is really just a fashion department's idea of what soldiers should look like. It feels as costume because it is one. Galactica's military doesn't look designed. It looks real, like an organization that existed long before the cameras showed up, with its own habits, shortcuts, and grudges already baked in. And that same idea, something that looks like it has history, not just design, is exactly what's happening with the technology on this ship, which is where it gets even more counterintuitive, because most of that tech looks almost embarrassingly outdated. But that's not a mistake. That's the whole point. Now here's the part that trips people up. If you look closely at Galactica's technology, it looks old. Corded phones, CRT monitors, manual switches and dials instead of touchscreens, paper checklists instead of tablets. On a show with faster-than-light travel, that seems dumb, but it's actually really smart. After the first Cylon War, the Colonials made a radical choice. They stopped networking their computers and backed away from advanced processors. Why? Because Cylons could hack anything connected. So the safest ships in the fleet were the oldest, least sophisticated ones, and Galactica, kept as a museum piece, was already about as basic as it gets. That's why Adama flatly refuses Roslyn's request to add a student computer network aboard his ship. And the story proves him right almost immediately. The colonial fleet had started reintroducing networked defense software designed by Gaius Baltar, and that software had a hidden backdoor, planted by a Cylon agent posing as his lover. When the attack comes, every modernized ship and Viper running that software gets disabled instantly. Galactica survives specifically because it never adopted the upgrade. The one ship that stayed technologically behind is the one ship still standing. Compare that to how most modern sci-fi handles technology, like glowing translucent screens, gestures in mid-air, interfaces that respond instantly and never explain why they look the way they do. It reads as advanced because it's expensive to render and unfamiliar to the eye, but it rarely has a cost. Nothing ever seems to lag, jam, or fail for a reason tied to the story. Galactica's tech fails constantly, and every failure means something. A jammed comm system isn't a throwaway detail, it's the reason a raptor can't call for help. A dead network isn't background noise, it's the entire reason humanity survives Night 1 of the war. That's what makes analog switches and CRT glow feel more futuristic, weirdly, than a hologram. They behave like tools. Something a person built, and something that can break in a way that costs them. And that same principle that limits, make things believable, carries straight into how the show dressed its people. Because just like the technology, the clothing wasn't designed to look impressive. It was designed to look like something a person could actually wear to work for 12 hours straight. Look at what people are wearing on this ship, and you'll notice something most sci-fi costuming skips entirely. Nothing here is trying to look cool. It's trying to look like gear. The costume department used real, specific fabric for the uniforms. Practical, military-grade material, not the shiny synthetic textiles you usually see in sci-fi. The color coding is functional. Duty blues for officers, green fatigues for enlisted crew with no other assignment, orange coveralls covered in reflective tape for deck handlers, black for Marines and security. You can read a person's job from across a hallway before they say a word. The clothing keeps telling the truth about these people's lives. Pilots come out of their flight suits looking like they've actually been sweating in a cockpit for hours. Nobody looks freshly pressed. These are clothes people have been living in for months, on a ship with limited water and no dry cleaning. Look at what people are wearing on this ship, and most of it reads as gear, not costume. But honestly, not every choice here is pure realism. Some design choices are just ridiculous. Take the pilots. Under the flight suit, every Viper pilot is wearing what fans call the double tank. A sleeveless undershirt, layered under a second sleeveless top. That's just ridiculous. Here's something most sci-fi shows never even attempt. Building a ship you could actually walk through, start to finish in a way that just makes sense. That tracking shot from the miniseries, moving from the CIC, through the ship's corridors, all the way out into the hangar deck, wasn't a visual effects trick. Production designer Richard Houdelin built the CIC and Galactica's hallways to physically fit together on one soundstage, laid out in a figure 8, intersecting at a central hub, on a stage about 200 feet long. The camera could genuinely walk that entire route in one take. Houdelin has talked about designing the hangar specifically to evoke a real aircraft carrier. Low overhead space, exposed structure. But here's the part worth being honest about. It wasn't purely practical. He deliberately built one wall of the hangar as a green screen because the physical set alone couldn't match the scale the ship was supposed to have. And the production reused the same wall sections to represent different parts of the hangar deck, just swapping out the wayfinding signage on each pass. It's the same trick as any studio backlot. Dress the same space to look like several different ones. And that unbroken walking shot? It only happened once. When the show moved from the miniseries soundstage to Vancouver Film Studios for the ongoing series, Houdelin confirms the set had to be split apart to fit the smaller stage. They lost the ability to do a continuous walkthrough of the CIC and hallways together ever again. The single most real architectural moment in the whole show was, by production necessity, a one-time trick. Where the realism holds up consistently, though, is in the story logic behind the wear. Galactica is an old-generation Battlestar, deliberately outdated compared to newer ships, and it never received the networked computer upgrades its sister ships got. So the riveted metal, the narrow hatches, the general sense of decades of use aren't just an art department mood board. They're a plot point the show earns. You can see the range of that design language by comparing Galactica to Colonial One. The President's ship, cleaner, more modern airliner because it's civilian, not a 40-year-old warship. So the real takeaway isn't everything here was built practically and nothing was faked. It's that even the fakes, the green screen, the redressed walls, were built to serve a story about age and decay, instead of just serving a single pretty shot. Things have limits, and limits are what make them believable. Start with the Vipers. The cockpits are built around analog-style gauges and physical switches, not floating displays. Visual effects supervisor Gary Hutzel has talked about wanting the ships to behave like actual rockets. Real thrust, real inertia, nothing that just casually breaks the laws of physics because it looks cool in the moment. A Viper running out of fuel is a real problem on this show. A missed jump calculation can strand a ship. There's no unlimited energy source quietly fixing every mistake off screen. Raptors lean even further into that idea. They're not glamorous. They're slow, boxy, sensor and cargo workhorses, styled more like a transport helicopter than a fighter jet. Nobody designed a Raptor to look heroic. They designed it to look like it does a job. Even the Cylons follow a consistent internal logic instead of being cool alien tech for its own sake. The show tracks an actual evolution, from purely mechanical Centurions to biomechanical raiders that are part ship, part organism, to humanoid models built to pass as human. Every version has a place in that lineage. Nothing shows up as a brand new, unexplained superweapon just because the plot needs one that week. And the small stuff reinforces it too. Data disks, clunky handheld readers, tools that are limited on purpose, tying straight back to the tech regression from the retro technology section. Nothing here is magic. Everything has a rule. Compare that to how a lot of modern sci-fi treats hardware. A new gadget appears exactly when the plot needs it, does something impressive, and nobody asks what it costs, how it works, or why it wasn't used 3 episodes earlier. It functions as a narrative shortcut, not an object. Galactica's version of advanced technology is a ship that can jump across a galaxy instantly, and might tear itself apart if it does that one too many times. That trade-off is the whole show's philosophy, condensed into one piece of hardware. And that's really the answer to the question this whole video is asking. Battlestar Galactica doesn't look more believable than modern sci-fi because it has more detail, or a bigger budget, or better effects. Modern shows usually win on all three. It looks more believable because every choice, from the uniforms to the hallways to the ships themselves, was built around the same idea. Things should behave like they have weight, history, and cost. Not because they look futuristic, because they look like they could actually break.